This week on Act Out, activism so often gets the bad rep of being all about sacrificing, all about pain and struggle, never about joy. And yet, as we find ourselves in a culture that preaches escapism, demands smiles, a Stepford Wife happiness that defies reality and also central nervous systems, what does joy even mean? Furthermore, what does activism mean? Militancy, rigid radicalism, the toxicity of movement spaces, and more. Well, let's dive in. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Brigade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. Many of you who watch this show work in community organizing or some form of activism, i.e. giving a fuck in action. In that case, you likely know and have experienced some of the pitfalls of giving a fuck in action. Burnouts, infighting, infiltration, trust issues, privilege, duplicating oppressive power structures, the oppression Olympics, etc., etc., etc. There's no shortage of ways to fall or indeed fail. So what keeps us going? Is it some solemn and depressing sense of duty in the face of not only internal issues but outward doomsdayism? Or could it be, and really should it be, the joy of militancy? And I can almost feel some folks bristling at those words. Joy? What the hell do we have to be joyful about? Militancy? I'm not a militant. I don't think. Well, allow me, or rather allow Carla Bergman, to shift not only your paradigms regarding those words, but indeed shift some paradigms regarding the work of giving a fuck in action. The power of asking questions of ourselves and our communities in order to not only manifest deep-rooted joy, but as it follows to then also manifest the change we so deeply seek and hope for. Indeed, to build thriving resistance in toxic times. Take a listen. Talk a little bit about the title, like in terms of joyful outside the commodified term happiness or blind optimism, and militancy as a connection to one's own power and the collaborative drive in community.
Well, I think I need to just tell a little bit of a background story that connects to both the term joyful militancy, but even predates that, and that is to really lean into the concept of joy. About 18 years ago, I went through a really horrible time personally, and I was just happened to be reading Spinoza at the time, and it really resonated with me, this idea that joy is something that can not necessarily be a good happening, but it does bring power to you. And so I, at that moment, or in those months of struggle, I decided to politicize the idea of joy in my life and really center it. So it was like a long time thinking it through and what that meant. And then in 2011, I was interviewing Richard Day for a film that I worked on, and I was explaining. Actually, it was funny. We were interviewing each other for both our films, and he asked me some questions about why I thought the project I was part of had a lot of joy and was doing well. And I explained what I thought was going on, and he said, that's joyful militancy. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term, and it just resonated, and I glommed onto it, and it became this thing that we made screen prints of it at the Purple Thistle Center in Vancouver, and T-shirts, became this kind of thing that we all kind of embraced. So it was part of a larger community conversation. And yeah, it definitely is. It's not the antithesis to happy, but it definitely has much more resonance within yourself, but also in a group or a collective, or it's so much more,
It's a lot deeper.
It's so much deeper, and there's you need some courage to, I think, go towards joy in the way that we articulated in the book. It is about transformation, which is hard, and it can mean some hard times and ending. It can mean endings, right?
Right.
So that was what hit me in 2001 was that I had two big endings happen in my life, and I still felt joy, and I couldn't figure it out. So I had to explore what that meant. And some people would maybe think that what I was feeling was freedom, some liberation, but I think it's all the same thing.
Right. And then and the idea of militancy, because I feel like so often people, and I obviously want to get into the idea of rigid radicalism, but I think that so often people hear the word militancy and they're like, oh, that means that you want to throw Molotov cocktails.
Right.
But it's really that's really not even what militancy really means.
No. Do you have a definition that you work with? And then maybe we can.
I mean, I think that something that you pinpointed in the book, the idea of connection to one's own power, and how that then relates to that feeling of oppression under the empire, I think is a really powerful way to put it, because then it's more about, well, how could I not be militant in terms of willing my own freedom and the freedom of others around me in this context that necessarily makes me militant.
To me, it transforms from just being an activist. It has more weight. It's like it's inflexible, but in terms of the core value position, but not in a rigid way, if that makes sense.
Right, and that's a great segue into the concept of rigid radicalism and the idea of being fluid but not flimsy, because something that you point out in the book is that rigid, it's what's rigid that ends up being fragile, and this idea of rigid radicalism falling into the same hierarchies, the same oppressive behaviors as the system that we're trying to fight and build outside of. Talk a little bit about like the concept of rigid radicalism.
Sure. I think I've had a few people I've noticed wonder why we use that term or what does it mean. And so it's just it's a placeholder really for sad militancy, because we did root our book in Spinoza's ideas of joy and sad passions. But when we first did the book, or we're interviewing people, of course, sadness has all kinds of connotations, and it feels like you're policing people's emotions, because, sadness is a real emotion. And, we'd have to always explain what we meant by sad in terms of it diminishing our power, our collective power. That it's not the sad as in like the emotion I'm, feeling grief. It's not that. So it just got complicated, and we spent probably months going back and forth of what are we going to use to be this, like a term that can talk about stagnation and about ways that stop transformation, stop the growth, stop the ability for emergent powers to rise. And we kept coming back to rigid radicalism right up until the very end. It never felt completely right, but it seems to work. And so the project that I was part of for quite a few years was called the Purple Thistle Center, which was founded by a group of youth and one adult. And then I became the director. And one of the questions that would come from other organizers was, do you teach them how to do consensus? Do you teach them how to run a space? And I'm like, no. Because here's the thing. Here's what I found in all the years. And I worked in a democratic school with younger kids too. Is that this isn't a surprise. It's a very anarchisty statement I'm going to say next. But, if the conditions are such, then it's amazing what people do when they're brought together, right? So if you bring a bunch of people together and they truly have autonomy and they truly have some power on what's going to happen with the place, like they get to have a say on the budget or the say on the budget or what they're going to organize, cooperation happens. Conversations happen. Doesn't mean that struggle and tension and even violence doesn't happen. It just means that it doesn't need to be taught. Like it's emergent. It's like we're actually very cooperative by nature, right? It's not about being a certain way, but it's about showing up with, just knowing you're being cared for and that the space is holding that, and that if you make a mistake, it's okay, right? And that you might be challenged, but you're not going to be ridiculed or taken down for maybe saying the wrong word.
And I think like another part of that you discuss in the book also is this idea is trust.
Right.
And how so often when we go into spaces, either there's a feeling of extreme security, like, oh, I can't trust anybody because I don't know who's going to be an infiltrator, or there's this feeling of like, oh, well, I demand that people trust me, because if they don't, then we can't work together. Talk a little bit about the problem of trust in these spaces as well.
Right. So one of the things that I think is really important is, like, I think when I talk about trust, I'm talking about a really specific trust, not the like trust you build over years of building a deep relationship with somebody, right? Like probably that type of trust is really only for a few people in your life. So this is the kind of trust that isn't high stakes. So the trust that I like to use the thistles as an example, because I think it's a really good example of this. So the youth would show up, a brand new person would show up, and they would be really interested in participating and being part of the collective. And the only thing that we asked is that you come to the meetings weekly, because we really felt that if you weren't in a relationship, you actually, we can't do this together. With giving or take some, concern around access and age and whatnot. But overall, that was the only thing we asked for. And the thing is that every youth in the place had a key to the place, and that was that act of trust up front. I think Kelsey Chap they speak about it in their interview that's in the book about what that did for them. Like, it just blew their mind that we didn't know them. They could have wanted to rip us off, but we just, here's this and here's that. And, here's access. So trust is very much a practical application in the sense that I'm talking about it. Thinking that people are going to show up and give their best. And you know what? In my experience of, I'm 52 years old, like the years of me doing this work and coming at organizing in the community with that as a really core value, people always rise up when they're trusted up front in this way.
And then, of course, the flip side of that is to, something that I thought was really good in the book that you discussed was like respecting that, if people have, personal traumas, or if they, we all exist somewhere on that privilege spectrum, and people who have been the most marginalized and oppressed by the system might have a really hard time trusting someone who looks like a representative, like a white male or something. And to understand that isn't, a personal attack against you, and that in that instance, like, trust might be more difficult and might need to be worked at harder or something like that, so that there's, offering up trust up front, but also recognizing if it can't be reciprocated.
Right. So yeah, that's like a really good distinction. Thanks for bringing that up, because it wasn't about demanding trust.
And with that, I think that another thing that sort of bridges that and rigid radicalism was the concept of, pragmatic principles versus these purity tests. That, you can't be in this space if you're not vegan, or you can't be in this space unless you're an anarchist, or any sort of ist that we've prescribed, and then, how that really combats the idea of trying to build these open and inclusive spaces, rather than these restrictive spaces that, again, just sort of mirror the hierarchies and the oppression that we're really trying to fight. Talk a little bit more about this concept of, like, the pragmatic principles over purity tests.
Right. I mean, I think for me, it's funny. I rewrote the book like in early 2016, so I'm like, what was that part again? But for me, the distinction's always been values versus principles. So, like, values are open and emergent and respond to the conditions you're in right now, and they're fluid. And principles are more set in, like, they're more religious or dogmatic or ideologically placed. Doesn't mean that you can't have, like, it doesn't mean you shouldn't have any principles, right? Like, I think I have some principles. I think we all do, right? It's about when we cross difference into creating a collective or a space or an organizing place. Like, what are those? And I think those conversations need to be happening all the time and shooken up. And that's why I don't believe in, like, a handbook for a space or like a how-to book, because it should be constantly changing based on who's in the room. And so I guess that would be the principle, right? The principle of the space is that it has to be, the values are constantly discussed and the way we organize has to be constantly chewed on and reimagined, and I think that's where ideology seeps in when we get too rigid. And I also want to say that I think groups that identify along whatever lines, if they want to get together based on those lines, they should.
Right.
And that's fine. And I don't like I think the flip side to that is that people shouldn't be allowed to organize based on whatever, So for me, cis women with a chronic health issue who does radical unschooling and parenting with their children. Like, I want to maybe meet with the other women with the same intersections as me, working class, right? Like, let's add it all in. I think that's okay. I think people, we need that. We need that camaraderie. We need a place to feel safe to say all the things that piss us off about people who don't do the things we do, whether it's veganism or whatever. But I think what we were trying to look at was like the larger organizing spaces and places where people are coming together to fight against the horrors of this world right now. Mm-hmm. So that, I just want to be really clear that I think all of it needs to be happening. We need to lots of care, lots of like ways of communicating and asking questions and being curious with each other.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think sometimes people have said like, oh, well, you're going to have like a women or femme only meeting, and that's really exclusionary. And it's like, well, no, we're only doing this because we do need some like female space right now, but it's not that we're not interested in organizing with our male counterparts. Like, that's not the point. It's just that sometimes there needs to be that space for people to share things that they feel comfortable sharing with somebody who really like can empathize on a different level as opposed to just sympathize.
Exactly. And also a place to vent, right? I think we talk a lot about like one of the ways that we've noticed for ourselves and for the people close to us, how they maybe are able to create the conditions sometimes for joyful militancy or for just care and radicalism with their groups, is that they carve out space to vent, to be pissed off, to be angry, to maybe say the shitty things, but with somebody they can trust and feel safe to like process it out, right? I think that this chasing perfectionism is what's really causing the illnesses in our groups.
Yeah.
Is like the bar, no one's going to reach it ever. So
yeah. And also another thing that you bring up in the book then is that like if we're always trying to build this perfection, we skip building in the here and now, and we're always trying to aim for this perfect utopia that's just on the other side of everyone's faults, but we'll never get there because it's impossible.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those perfection ideals, I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's really kind of, I don't know, like a lot of the things when we think back and we look at history, I think looking back at past struggles and what worked and what didn't work is really, really important. But I think we need to like look back and find the voices who we didn't get to hear from. So I think we have this we love charismatic leaders. We love the one like across the ideological spectrum, across media. Like we do this. We like, every movement had the charismatic leader, and that's who gets quoted the most, and that's who tells the story. And it's just one story sometimes, right? And it's a very narrow story, and then we're doomed then to have problems as collectives or as groups or as organizing neighborhoods or whatever, because there's a powerlessness in that, right? Like we're looking for that leader. We're looking for the person who's going to tell us like the story. But the stories are within us all, and it's a really exciting time right now because we're seeing that happen. Right, we're seeing the cracks everywhere. All the new stories coming out from all the past movements and resistance. Where there's like whether you're like the media you're doing, or I do a project called Emma Talks, which is a feminist TED Talks type thing, and part of the mandate is to just get the stories heard from the people who don't always get to tell the story. And you're seeing that proliferation happening across media, across everywhere. And it's wonderful because I think that's a site where I think the most hope can happen. And we can stop maybe having these really distorted ideas of what a perfection movement looks like, because it's based on like just a small lineage of people.
Right.
Yeah. So.
And the other thing that with regards to the being flexible on like not having a handbook for spaces, and saying that we constantly need to come back to what our values are and everything, and then also how that doesn't mean that you should be flexible on everything. Like
Right.
For example, you said that you're very militant about the autonomy of children. It's like that's not going to change just because you sit down and say like, okay, well, how are we going to change our or update or whatever. It's like it doesn't mean that it was flexible on everything. Like there are some core pieces, and that's also an interesting thing. Like, how do you find or in a lot of ways create those core pieces for yourself, and then feel comfortable enough to say, look, I can't budge on this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, making mistakes, failing lots on that one. Learning, having a lot of people in my life be really great to me. When I did fumble and fail and lose my center and lose my principles because I, got confused and wasn't sure how to be. And so, yeah, trial and error. But, yeah, this idea of, like, not flimsy, I think is the term, how we say it. Flexible but not flimsy, because, I remember, like, I don't really want, like we had a free space, so a lot of people could come in and make, use all the materials and use the stuff. Anybody could come in, and the youth ran the space, and some of them were the artists who offered the workshops, and and there was a couple occasions where somebody was making fascist art, and they just got straight up kicked out. And like, of course, right? Yeah. Like, get out. Yeah, you're not allowed. You're not. Yeah. So that's like an example of flexible and open, but not flimsy, right? Like, really like clear on that one.
That's an interesting thing too. Is like feeling where you draw the line between, sitting down with someone, being, hey, look, like what you said was kind of fucked up, and let's sit down and talk about it, as opposed to somebody, taking advantage of people, or, being like outwardly fascist, like, and that's the other thing. It's like, I feel like every space or every group draws that line for themselves. There's not like a line, but that's, the interesting thing too that you talk about in the book is like the call out culture, and like being sure to not just like call people out like you're dropping confetti or something, but at the same time having that line where it's like, actually beyond this, it's not cool.
Right. Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you wrapping up here is the power of asking questions of ourselves and of the people that we're organizing with. Like, what kind of, how do you get started with even like, what questions do I ask myself to start off with? Like, where am I, for people who feel a little lost in these spaces, that feel a little, turned away or shy because they don't know the right words or things like that. Like, what kind of questions do you even start with in this process?
Yeah, that's a really big question.
I know.
My curiosity is just going crazy. I want to first say thank you very much for saying that. I saw your Instagram post, and it was really exciting because I just didn't expect that kind of feedback. The critiques of our book are coming from a place of pretty pissed off that we didn't write the how-to, and that we didn't give instructions on how to concretely deal with rigid radicalism. And to me, that speaks volumes of that there is confusion and uncertainty, and I also like chuckle at that. And I actually part of why I said yes to this interview is that I want to respond to all those people and say, like, the minute we write that how-to, we actually replicate what we are exposing as the problem. I think that there's such incredible people out there who know how to be in the world in these ways that we're talking about, in human relations and like organizing and making people feel a lot of care and acceptance and hospitality. But something gets lost when they start writing how to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because the problem is, and I've seen it over and over again, is that people can't actually do it from your position.
Right.
They need to find their way. And I think we haven't even begun to unearth all the different ways we can be different with each other. And the reason why we wrote the book the way we did is we really wanted to center all the ways that we can be otherwise, and all the ways that people are already doing incredible things, and that empire and colonialism and capitalism and racism makes us feel powerless, makes us feel like we're not making strides and we're not doing amazing things, but we are every day, all the time. And we are up against some of the worst times of known history. Yeah. But I think that we've got to keep asking questions, because we do not have a blueprint. We do not know how to handle today's problems in the way that they are being presented to us.
We haven't had a Get Cozy segment in a while. So let me take this opportunity to seriously suggest joyful militancy, particularly as Act Out is taking a 2-week hiatus here, so you'll have some extra time for reading. For seasoned activists, as well as those just embarking on that giving a fuck in action, the insight inside joyful militancy is like a self-help book for those trying to both fight and build. So check it out, and on that note, we'll wrap up this week's joyful dose of dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Again, do check out the last slide and the show description to find sites mentioned in this week's show, and for interim updates as well as posted videos, images, and articles, visit us on social media. To those who have donated to keep the show going, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, until next time, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man, but I will kill for what I